Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Joe Principe. I am Vice President of Strategic Alliances with Patheon Pharmaceuticals. A pleasure to be here today. I'm going to be talking to you briefly about mitigating demand and forecast uncertainty in the pharmaceutical sector. Before we do that, dig into some of the specifics, I'd like to take a look at some of the trends affecting the pharmaceutical market in general and how those are creating different pressures and realities as it pertains to decision making around capacity planning, and procuring capacity for product portfolios. So let's take a look a little bit at some of the trends affecting pharma companies. I think it's fairly obvious that the industry is undergoing rapid change, right? More so than ever before. Information flows more freely. Scientific breakthroughs come quicker in the industry. This is impacting some of the decision processes. The changing regulatory environment is causing new thinking around regulatory strategies and how does that impact the manufacturing planning. There's payer pressure on pharmaceutical companies, more so now than ever before. Even before product launches, we're seeing discussions around the price in the market and how is that going to be addressed. Patient requirements are more visible. We're living in a social media world where patient concerns and needs are very quickly translated into the market. Rising costs in product development affect all pharmaceutical companies. Speed to market is vitally important, not only for product launches in a timely fashion, but also getting rid of from the portfolio those products that actually won't be successful. So killing the dogs as quickly as possible continues to be a theme of pharmaceutical development. So if you take this all in together, it begins to create different pressures on the industry. Right? The factors combine to create uncertainty around capacity requirements. Let's dig into that just a little more deeply. So how are pharma companies affected if you believe the bullets I've just shown you? Companies have to think about their manufacturing strategies for a product on average about 3 years before the product is actually launched. The challenge with this is that they know very little about what that capacity requirement actually looks like at the time that they have to make the decisions about the manufacturing strategy. So the opportunity cost of getting this wrong is really very high. If you err to the high side, you wind up with a factory perhaps that is underutilized or unutilized. If you err to the low side, you have the potential to short the market for product and lose all the revenues and margin that are associated with that product. The typical CDMO pharma company relationship has not really adequately understood or addressed this problem historically. CDMO companies very much like very firm and very clear forecasts, and that's been sort of the nature of the legacy model as it's existed to today. Traditional pharma company relationships really, again, don't know how to mitigate this uncertainty around demand forecasting. Flexible, scalable manufacturing capacity is a unique solution in the industry, and we believe it's going to be the forward discussion for many of the relationships that we hold at Patheon, and certainly that the industry will have to solve going forward. Flexible capacity, if it actually can be delivered, can mitigate the uncertainty around demand planning. So we're going to get into some deeper thinking around this in just a second. A CDMO with an understanding of flexible capacity, access, scalability, utilization is in a unique position to provide flexible access to manufacturing capacity. So it sounds very simple, yet it has been something that's eluded the industry for quite a long time. So how do you do it? What are the key principles around mitigating demand uncertainty in the industry? First off, CDMO solutions exist outside of the traditional procurement, RFP-driven approach to the market, right? They just require a different thinking and a different conversation between the pharma company and the supply chain providers. They require strategic collaborative dialogue as opposed to transactional, again, RFP-driven conversation. And optimum flexible capacity solutions will exist outside of price per batch mentality. And this is a very key point because in our industry, these relationships always default to what's the price per batch, and that's kind of what the procurement model has focused itself on, mitigating and minimizing the identified capacity need cost. The challenge is that that's not the problem we're solving for in a flexible capacity model, and what we hear from our clients on a regular basis is that part we understand. It's the part around forecasting demand that we don't see that is the challenge. And so unique solutions are required to provide solutions to those problems. It requires flexible capacity forecasting, and demand uncertainty requires very different thinking. So let's look at that a little bit. Some very simpler approaches to mitigating demand uncertainty are some of the more simple things like validating across multiple lines. Again, in the traditional procurement pharma company relationship, this isn't something that's often done, but is sometimes done. So if you validate in 2 sites in a CDMO or 2 sites in an internal network, that gives you some mitigation of uncertainty of demand forecast and the ability to use that capacity for other products if there are surges in the market. Spillover capacity can be utilized for other projects, as I just said, requiring that same specific type of capacity. But even this requires thinking beyond the traditional batch approach. Another example might be, and this is a fairly simple example, would be if in biologic drug substance, for example. The use of multiplexed single-purpose 2,000 liter reactors is a very different solution to 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 liter reactors that are very expensive, have to be managed in a different way. You can multiplex very small biologic reactors, add them in concurrence, and pool the downstream. Different approach, fairly easy to deliver. Capacity scalability can be created within an internal network or a CDMO's global network. So you can procure perhaps and qualify, as I'd mentioned earlier, across a particular type of capacity, different geographies, different plant locations. Fairly simple and deliverable in today's relationship model. The value capture is high relative to traditional procurement acquired capacity if you think differently. So we're going to get into a little bit more around how to do that. What I would say is the challenges around the business modeling are as difficult as the challenges around the operational planning associated with manufacturing flexibility. So let's look at a couple different models, if we can, around scalable, flexible manufacturing, access to manufacturing capacity. In the center, you see the traditional model. So this is effectively an identified need. A procurement organization goes out to their supply base and says, we want to acquire this much capacity in this time frame. Fairly straightforward, easy to deliver, because that's been the lion's share of the relationship between pharma companies and their supply chain, whether it's internal manufacturing or external. It's pure capacity reservation with no flexibility. So this is a traditional capacity reservation for the identified need. Multiple clients at a CDMO, that's the typical CDMO model. And the product mix is very limited. So if you have an identified need for some sterile manufacturing, you know how much volume you need, you know how much to go out and procure. These models that are highlighted around it are really the beginning of thinking around very different approaches to identifying and procuring flexible manufacturing capacity when you don't understand what the demand actually is. Again, that's the problem we're solving for. So a dedicated capacity model. Let me explain a little bit about what that is. That is effectively where a client wants access to a specific type of technology. It could be a liquid line, a lyo line, a syringe line, it could be an oral solids line. You don't know how much you need, but you're willing to buy a big chunk of it. And that is a very simple way to gain access to more capacity effectively than you know you need at any given time. We'll get into some of the pros and cons, but this is a fairly straightforward model. The assets typically are owned by the CDMO or the client. CDMOs would typically want to claw back if they sell that capacity to other customers. It usually involves a single client, and products can be multiple and mixed. So you can have a portfolio of products that you are working through a block of capacity that you've procured either internal or external to your organization. To the right, we see a bit of a more novel concept in the CDMO space, and that's fractional ownership. So a good example of understanding this would be NetJets. If you're aware of NetJets is a fractional ownership of an aircraft. A limited number of customers will actually buy a share of a jet and then pay a variable cost every time they use that jet. In exchange for that, they can at any time say, I need that jet to go from point A to point B, and typically the agreement with NetJets is in 4 hours' time you can have access to that plane. Well, fundamentally, there's no reason that similar thinking cannot be applied to manufacturing in the pharmaceutical sector. And in fact, we've developed at Patheon some models with which to do that and provide this sort of capacity. So this would typically involve a specific type of asset, a very small number of clients who have a shared and common interest that can be pulled together in terms of their demand requirements. And portfolios of products can be run through this sort of a model. We're going to get into some of the pros and cons in a bit more detail on each of these models in just a second. A different model would be the flexible network access approach. That is effectively saying, how do I gain access to a CDMO's network for a particular type of capacity that's required? And business models exist, again, with which to model and provide and sell capacity for a particular type of technology, whether it's, again, sterile, oral, solid, whatever it is, sort of on demand. So you don't know exactly what you need, but you know that once you identify what you need it. And you need to be able to slot it, procure it, right? So this is a different approach. Again, we're going to go into some details on each one of these and some of the pros and cons as we understand it. And then lastly, we have in the bottom right what we call a condominium model. This is a very unique solution. Patheon has had several examples that they've executed within the pharmaceutical sector in our client base. This is a very unique solution where a client has a very specific purpose and type of manufacturing asset that isn't available in the market today as we speak. So they need to find someone who can help them build a very purpose-built facility. We've got several examples of this where single client, single purpose facilities have been constructed and put into practice, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let's look at the traditional model of reservation capacity. This is effectively just reserving a block of capacity based on an identified demand or an unidentified amount of demand. It is not the most efficient model, but there are companies who believe it's a good model because they're willing to pay for flexibility as opposed to identified batches. It allows the ability to sell around that client-specific capacity. So if you're not fully utilizing an asset, then there's the ability for the CDMO to sell what the pharma company is not using. It normally does not require CapEx because it relies on capital that's already in place within your CDMO. And it's a simple business model that's really understood by the industry and in practice in many cases today. Some pros and cons around the model. It's challenging. It challenges in scheduling client changes. So when you're selling to multiple clients on a line, it's very difficult to move products around because regulatory strategies dictate that certain things have to be done in certain time frames. It offers little flexibility around capacity requirement changes at the client level. Contracts are generally fairly short. They're short for the identified period of demand requirement. And there's some risk to the CDMO revenue if the contracts terminate and you're left with capacity that needs to be resold because there's a sell cycle associated with any type of capacity in the CDMO space. The value associated with this type of simple model is it's just easily understood, and it's been the core of the CDMO pharma company relationship for a very long time. So let's talk about dedicated capacity model. This is something a little bit different. This is where a pharma company comes and says, we want to have our own prefilled syringe line. No one else can use it. Can you help us to do that? We can, and there are pros and cons to this type of a model. In a dedicated capacity model, clients can acquire access to a specific type of capacity with the freedom to use and flex flexibly that capacity for whatever purpose they want and for whatever product mix that they might want to put in there. The contracts are typically longer in nature and a secure source of revenue for the CDMO while at the same time providing complete flexibility for the pharma company. The challenge is if the asset is underutilized, it's an expensive model. At high utilization rates, this sort of a model provides a very efficient cost of goods basis, which is a clear plus side for the pharma company, again, if they're using it at high utilization. They're typically done in single clients, so a client will come in and just say, we want this playground, we're willing to pay for it, and we'll use it as we deem appropriate. One of the overwhelming value components of a model like this, in the Patheon view of things, is that it actually eliminates tech transfer costs completely because you can construct business models that actually allow the client to do anything they want on the line, including transfer products in and out, without incurring historic transactional tech transfer charges. So you're effectively paying for a playground with which you can do anything you want to do, and this is a model that addresses that. Some of the risks associated is that the facility itself is tied up. Once it's secured, it's secured, and if a pharma company wants to release some of that capacity they procured, they run the risk of losing the flexibility. So there's a bit of a conundrum there that requires some different thinking. It can be a capital burden if it's an unusual type of asset that doesn't exist or needs to be procured. Then the conversation about who's paying for that asset and how do those costs get distributed over the course of the business is a typical conversation that would be required. But again, from a flexibility standpoint, a pharma company in this model can effectively do anything they want, anytime they want, and mix their portfolio ad hoc within reason, and eliminate tech transfer costs. So it's a nice model for consolidating products that you have out at multiple CMOs, that perhaps you're managing 6 different relationships, each with 1 or 2 products, that can be consolidated into a CDMO, making the management of the relationship an easier thing to do. Fractional ownership. So back to this NetJets thing. What are the pros and cons of fractional ownership? It's not really something that the industry has known how to offer. It requires different levels of planning from an S&OP perspective, and it requires a business model that has been really unaddressed by the pharmaceutical CDMO relationship historically. In this model, there would be a limited number of clients, again with a certain type of demand that's similar, who would procure access or procure the asset in the CDMO space. That the management of the capacity requirements around that asset would be managed by the CDMO, so long as you guarantee each of those clients a timely access to a specific type of capacity. This is very different than CDMO relationships have been historically, where again the reliance on very specific forecasting has been the model, and the discomfort associated with managing flexibility has really been a challenge for the industry to address. There's a challenge in selling this kind of model. It's really very different. So how do you find 3 different companies who are interested in a particular type of technology who would consider pulling the resources together and actually procuring sort of fractional capacity with a CDMO supplier? It requires a level of strategic conversation that doesn't typically exist in the transactional model in the industry, and is only available to really those pharma companies and CDMOs who have a much deeper conversation, more strategic relationship. The value proposition here again being fairly straightforward. Again, it offers tremendous amount of flexibility from a product mix standpoint. TT costs are mitigated completely because you can move any product mix that you want in and out of your block of capacity. So a different model. This is the one that's probably the most attractive from the feedback we've gotten from our client base, but also the most difficult to deliver. And this is a flexible access model that allows access to capacity across a network. So for example, a client would say, we'll qualify our product in 3 of your sites that have lyophilization capabilities. Our ask is that at any point in time, we want to be able to give you a month's notice to get access to a line. That's been something that the industry has really not historically delivered, and requires both a very different S&OP planning model as well as a financial business model to put deals like this together. But they are doable. They work very nicely with global regulatory strategies where you might want to launch in specific geographies, and you could do product mixes in different geographies. Again, value proposition is you have mitigation of risk by being able to place products in multiple facilities globally. Very consistent quality standards across the CDMO that they impart on the different sites within the network, and it's capital light. So these are assets that typically would exist in a CDMO, where you would effectively be buying access to a block of capacity, as opposed again to batch pricing. And more we hear interest in sort of the access to capacity being what the company wants, as opposed to a batch and a price per unit cost. And then lastly, this condominium model. This is again where there is a need for capacity that is unavailable in the market historically. It might be very specific to a technology. No CDMO offers it. So what does the pharma company do? They go to someone who's willing to construct that for them, help them manage it, or manage it for them. As in the case of Patheon, we actually run these facilities for the clients, and they're very purpose-built. Single client, single purpose facility. It is not without risk, and also has some good advantages. So obviously, immediate pros, it provides access to specialized capacity for a pharma company that can't find that capacity anywhere out there in a network. There's a long runway to market launch, and it requires that there's a shared risk associated with the CDMO and the pharma company, that if the product doesn't launch, you've just built a factory that doesn't work, and how are you going to mitigate that strategy? But they're not resellable facilities typically, because they're so specific to a type of capacity that the market doesn't broadly have use for. The contracts are long-term in nature. That is it. It's a single-purpose, single-client facility. They're not going to go out and build that same facility with 3 CDMOs. They're going to pick one and run with it, and that's the model. And it's captive business if the product is a success on the market. So the depth of the relationship between the pharma company and the supplier is very strong here. But the facility's tied up, and it inhibits site changes. There's an opportunity cost of footprint. So like any CDMO pharma company relationship, we think about on the CDMO side the revenue opportunity cost of the footprint associated with any of our facilities. And if you have a purpose-built facility with a product that didn't meet its forecast needs, there are risks associated with that. There's also decommissioning risks associated to a model like this. Again, when the product runs its course, you're now sitting on a facility that there's no other products in the market to address, and there's decommissioning costs that are associated with the model that need to be built into the business and financial model. But it provides access to types of capacity for products that can be very important in the market for unmet needs, for niche indications that can't be had anywhere else. So we're very proud to have executed some of these models within Patheon, and we continue to have numerous dialogues about doing more of the same. So I've given you some overview of sort of some of the thinking around the industry pressures that are created on pharma companies, the challenges that they have around thinking about how they're planning their demand forecasting and how they're going to acquire that demand planning within either their internal networks or the CDMO space. If there are any questions that I can answer, I'd be happy to address them, or you're all welcome to swing by our booth in hall number 3, where we'll also be pleased to take your questions.